There's just no getting around it. There is going to be displacement of work. How do I communicate the larger value of what I do that can't be replicated by AI? Because the technical craft, if it can't be replicated now, it will be once the technology advances. But the ability to connect with an audience, the ability to make strong strategic recommendations that help them achieve their business objectives, that's something an AI can't replicate, because that's...
Okay, so I'm thrilled to have Kevin Rapp on the podcast today, and I think this will be a really interesting podcast because Kevin has a different take on AI to me. I'll give you a little intro if you don't know Kevin. He's a creative director who's worked with startups all the way to brands that you know like Netflix and Twitter, and he's known for challenging the status quo. So it should be a lively conversation. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Luke. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Let's get straight into it then. So I think we're in this period where creatives don't know how to react to AI. Like they're questioning, should I be fighting against it? And a lot of people are, or should we compete against it? Or maybe we should collaborate. So
sure,
we've spoke before, so I know what your opinion is on this. So you've chosen not to work with AI tools. Yeah. So why don't we start there? So Kevin, why not AI?
So I want to start by, I think I want to disambiguate, right? AI is such a vast thing. So when we're talking about AI, we are specifically talking about generative AI art and copy tools, right? AI as a full spectrum of, as an industry, has a lot of different applications all over. And there are probably tools that I'm using that are utilizing AI in ways that I don't know about. So like, for me to say I don't use AI is probably a little bit of an exaggeration. I have chosen not to use specifically the large language model tools like Midjourney or ChatGPT or Sora. So that's my pedantic spiel to get out of the way before we dive into the meat of the question. And you're right, Luke. I have chosen not to use these generative AI tools. And there are a couple of different reasons for that. And so I'll start by just overviewing all of them and then dive in a little deeper. So obviously, number one, the ethical concerns of how the models are trained. Then there's the overall, what I consider to be the efficacy of the tools versus the hype of them. Then there's some legal concerns around the tech and again, around the way the models are trained. And finally, the environmental concerns. So let me break each of those down. Starting with the ethical concerns, that's one that I think probably a lot of the people that you're talking to have kind of a broad overview of the conversation. Though the models being trained on basically the whole of the internet without the consent and compensation of the artists that were involved in creating that artwork is something that I just can't get on board with. I just find that something that I am uncomfortable ethically with, utilizing a tool that is using artwork to train it without the fair consent and compensation of the artists. Then with the efficacy, I think we are getting a lot of that hype train around this is a tool that is eventually going to replace artists, or like we see a world in which this is going to be taking our jobs. And for me, I just haven't seen the data that shows that this tool or that these resources are able to replicate the creative mind. I just don't think that I don't think that the hype is warranted based on what I've seen of the tech. I think we're seeing a lot of derivative content being produced by this technology, but not something that is truly capable of solving the business problems in the way that a creative mind is able to. So my next one, and I know I'm monologuing right now, and you and I will dive into the conversation aspect of this. So this is my opening kind of argument, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of conversation about each of these. The next part is the legal side. As someone who's been involved in video production for almost 20 years now, there's so much that is required to legally license creative work that you create. Like when I'm on a live action shoot, we have to make sure every logo is either covered or been cleared to be able to be used. Every piece of artwork that's in the frame has to be Creative Commons. Like if we are promoting a brand, we have to make sure that is legally airtight from every perspective. And I have a hard time recommending to clients that I can use this tool in something that's going to be a finished piece of artwork when I can't truly say that there's no legal liability. Of course, the court system is still out on this. There's still a lot to be determined, and fair use is a pretty open to interpretation law. But I tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to my clients being sued because I want to make sure that they are as bulletproof as possible with the content I create. And then finally, the environmental concerns. So obviously, this consumes a lot of water. There is a lot to think about in the environmental effects and the sociological effects even of the people who are helping train these models and are sifting through imagery of violent or sexual imagery in order to catalog it and help train the models. There's just a lot to think about that I think we haven't really truly integrated into the conversation yet of what is the true impact of what these tools are doing to make creative work faster and more efficient, right? Is the cost truly worth it? Is something that I'm constantly wrestling with as I see the conversation evolve over this technology. So those are like the four kind of big buckets of where my concerns come in. And they all have lots of little hand-wringy nuances in all of them. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you about it, Luke, because I think we've gotten into this binary argument of this is a tool that you have to adopt or be left behind versus the tool is theft. And those are like the two arguments. And I think there's so much more nuance in all of them and how this tool can be applied or how this technology can be applied that I'm excited to have a more nuanced conversation about it.
Yeah, that's a great introduction, really. That's like all the major points. But I think let's start with the ethics of it, really, because I think that's where a lot of creatives just stop. And like you've mentioned,
correct,
as theft is art.
Yep.
And it's something that I struggle with. Obviously, I've lent into AI a lot more than you. We're doing a podcast about it. I learn almost as much as I can. But this is, my initial reaction was the same. This is very bad. So then you try and dig into it. And so what is it actually doing? Is it just copy and pasting like parts of someone's image into a new piece?
And that's where it's like hard to say because I'm not an engineer. I'm not a data scientist. I have seen pieces that feel like complete replicas of other artwork. And it's, but that might be how it was entirely prompted to be as derivative of the original artwork as possible. So it is an interesting line because the closest thing that I can think of it is music sampling, right? Like where there are some areas where you can clearly see this is a replica or this was taken from an original piece of artwork and recontextualized to make something new. And that's an area where there is a clear legal license of how you have to go about that process. But what if it's taking like less than 1% of that song? And it's like taking one snare sound out of this entire song and it's completely recontextualizing it in a way that you wouldn't even notice that it was part of it. Like, where is that line is something that I think is interesting and hard to truly parse. And for me, because I don't understand how it's trained, because I don't know how much of something else it's taking, it makes it hard for me to utilize because I can't say how much of this is taken from somebody else. And the one thing I do know is that artist is not credited and compensated. And so for not understanding the contribution that I'm taking from somebody else, it makes me uneasy to use the tech.
Yeah, it's definitely. I think there's some things that easy to say that feels wrong. So if we look at like Mid-Journey for something, if you write a text prompt and you put the name of another artist in there, whether or not that output does look like that artist's work, there's still an uneasiness, and
Yeah, totally.
and you're allowing that.
They are totally allowing it. And in lack of understanding of the way the tech was built, like not being a data scientist, not looking at the code, I have to look at the behavior of the company in order to make those determinations on whether I think what they're doing is ethical. And some of the stuff that we're seeing come out from the company based off of some of the lawsuits that we're seeing is making me feel uncomfortable about the ethics of the way the company is acting. So the CEO of Midjourney had said, oh, we don't have databases of artists that we are specifically trying to train on. Like, we're just collecting all of this data. And then when we see in the lawsuits, we see conversations where they're like, hey, here's our database of 20,000 artists that we are intentionally scraping in order to build our models. And you could even see in the messages where they're like, we're okay from a fair use standpoint, but if anyone really questions that, we can launder the data. Like, they use the phrase launder the data. And when I consider the ethics of how somebody is using their process, I would consider the phrase launder the data to avoid any criminal prosecution or any legal implications. I would consider that maybe more on the unethical side. That's just my personal take.
Yeah.
Might be a hot take, but that's where I'm feeling.
Yeah. So let me throw like a different angle at it.
Yeah, please.
So it's easy to talk about Midjourney. So say Midjourney at the moment, they have something called style reference, which is like a code you put at the end, and then it will give you a certain style, and then you can generate an image of a tree or a person or a dog and that stuff. There's I don't know how they make these codes. Well, we know where the data came from. Okay, but technically how they make the codes.
Correct. Yeah.
But yeah, that's something like, as a human looking at someone's work and going, I like their style, I'm going to use some of their style in my work. And as artists, we do that specifically. We create mood boards and we copy other artists. But it feels different when a computer does it.
It does. And I think one of the common arguments is this is how humans learn too, right? I started by tracing artwork. I started by filtering all of the influences of the things and artists that I really cared about. And that's part of my journey of becoming a better artist. But I have human lived experience that informs the artwork that I create. Even when I am taking influence from something, my lived experience is inherently going to come through in the art that I create. It is what I am taking from this inspiration. I don't think that an algorithm is capable of having inspiration. It is capable of parsing data and then interpreting it through an algorithm, but it's not the same thing. And I think we've watched too many sci-fi movies where we see AI technology that has been anthropomorphized, where it has like this human natural intellect. And so we tend to anthropomorphize this artificial intelligence and say it learns like humans, but it doesn't. It doesn't. It's an algorithm. Like, and in the same way that it knows how to serve you Facebook ads based on a product you've searched for, it's like it understands the data points and it knows how to serve you. It doesn't know you. It's not something that, like, it sees patterns and then is able to replicate them and create derivative versions of those patterns. It's not learning like a person. And I think that debate is something that I find really flawed and is changing the discourse when we're trying to talk about the ethics of the tech itself.
Yeah, it's definitely complex. People have different emotive responses to different kind of uses. Like
totally.
Midjourney is an easy one because you can directly see it and feel it. But
exactly.
When you start talking about things like video, so to create like a really good video model, you would need a model that understands physics and the way that the 3D world looks and what a certain kind of tree looks like, that's a lot more palatable, because you look out the window, who owns that? That's the world.
Sure.
But when we're talking about kind of artists and styles, it's a lot more emotive.
It is a lot more emotive, and it makes it more charged emotionally, I think, because for so long, many of us creatives have identified our core value as what our artistic voice is. You know what I mean? And so we derive a lot of the value of what we bring to society, to our clients if we're in the commercial space, or to the culture if we're more on the artistic space. We derive that from our authentic human voice and the way that we express ourselves creatively. And so when we see something that is capable of replicating that voice and replicating that human expression and commercializes it and productizes it, that can feel really threatening. It can feel like a violation for us and feel like, what is our purpose then? What is our space in this world? And I think for me, I've yet to see the tools create something that has that expression in the same way that my favorite artists have ever done. I've seen things that I say, okay, that has a professional level gloss, that has some of the technical skill of some of the things that I've, on a surface level, this looks like something that a competent artist would create. But I haven't had that emotional connection to the work that I feel when I see artwork from somebody that I truly admire. It doesn't connect with me emotionally, and it has that uncanny valley-ish vibe to it, where things are a little too glossy. They're a little bit separated from the emotional connect that I get from an art that is expressing something deeper. And that's where I go into that efficacy side of the argument. It's we've seen that this produces faster. We've seen that it produces cheaper. But does it produce in a way that can emotionally connect with an audience in a way that a true creative can? And I'm not sure that it can. And the tech will get better. Sure, the tech is always going to get better. But is it capable of replicating what a true creative person can do? That I'm not sold on. And I'm open to changing my mind if I see it, but I haven't seen it yet.
I think that's like, I think we could be getting close to that. I accept what you say. Like, you read something written by AI, you feel it before, like, the images can, yeah, there's something off. But I think the area that we probably getting closest is kind of music. That's come so quickly, very recently. Yeah. And so I want to ask you a question.
Please.
Do you feel like all this AI is an attack on culture? And I want to explain that a little bit, because we are now getting very good at music. The images are getting very close. And it's coming for culture, isn't it, really? Like, we've even got a new AI that I read about this week, and they're going to produce, like, it's the AI of Netflix.
Right.
So that you're going to be able to come up with the characters and the plot, and then it generates an episode for you. So it's like art, music, TV shows. Do you think all this AI is like devaluing our culture?
It's a really good question, Luke. And I'd say that it is and it isn't. So on the very technical sense, it devalues creative because it is producing a cheaper version of the creative that you're used to purchasing. So like on a very technical level, like it is the definition of devaluing a service or a thing that we do. But my view is, the way I'm seeing it is, I think as this content becomes cheaper and easier to produce, we all have sat through Netflix, like scrolling for something that would catch our eye, right? We've all done this. We know what this feels like. And so as content becomes more available, as creative becomes broader scale, more in your face, and your feed becomes more and more cluttered, it takes the things that are truly unique and connecting to stand out. And so I think, yes, it's devaluing creative from a purely logistical standpoint. When we look at what is going to be required from creative, I think we'll see the things that really stand out. And we might get to a place in the conversation where it's like, oh, we truly do need creative, because the tool by itself isn't going to get us there. We need creatives. And when I look at this at a broader conversation, I view AI as a symptom of the larger problem, which is that creative as a whole is already devalued. Like, when we look at it, creative is subjective. It is art. It's hard to measure. The people who sign the checks typically aren't creatives, so they don't inherently value it. And we see this manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Advertising companies pitch for free in order to get their foot in the door and win a project, right? Like, these are things that devalue creative. People who are creatives have a hard time recognizing and advocating for their value. So they have harder, like, steeper climbs up their career trajectory to get the advancements and promotions because, again, their work is subjective and hard to measure. So getting at the true value of creative is something that's really hard to quantify. And when we see something like this pop up, this technology that can productize creative, and you don't have to worry about all the messy creative mess that comes with the creation process, I can see why it's really appealing to these kinds of stakeholders that already don't value what creative brings to the table. And so when I look at what the future is, when I look at how creatives can exist in this space, we already were fighting the battle of how do we communicate our value even outside of this kind of technology. And I think now this is just making that conversation more important to have right now, and maybe even a little harder to have right now.
Why do you think creativity isn't valued or devalued?
I think it's a really systemic problem. And it starts very early on in your career as an artist. When I was a young person and I was drawing in my sketchbook, people were like, ooh, I'm going to see your name in the movie credits one day. And then when I started to pursue it as a career, those conversations changed. Suddenly it became, but what are you going to do with that? Or do you have a fallback plan? You know what I mean? The conversation changes from, I'm in awe of your talent and I can't wait to see what you do with it, to, oh, but this is the real world. And this isn't a space where art is something that you can use as a capitalist tool, right? Like, it is something that we have baked into our culture to believe that it does not add value, despite the fact that literally it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It is part of every business. It is part of every piece of entertainment. It is part of our culture. And because it is not a thing that is truly easily replicatable, the true sense of creative, a true idea that resonates with people and motivates them to change their behavior or change their action or change their perspective, something that can do that, like, the closest thing I can compare it to is magic, because it's really truly difficult to understand an audience and motivate them to make behavior change. And I don't think executives or stakeholders truly despite the fact that they know the impact, it's a lot easier to measure and say, yeah, this media buy got us 15% higher conversions. It's a lot easier to say, because we put this ad in this place in front of this audience, like the logistical like through line is we did this strategy and that led us to this dollar amount. It is a lot harder to parse and say, because of these creative decisions we made, because we understood this audience, because we understood their psychology, because we made them feel this way, we made them change their behavior. It's hard to parse. It's hard to measure. And so the results are usually oriented towards the marketers, when I think the creative itself is what really is doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
That's a good point. You could have crap creative, you could have good creative, and if they push them both in the same place, one's gonna do good, but how do you quantify it?
100%. 100%. And one of the things that gets me about the argument of you can produce it fast, you can produce it cheap, and cheapness isn't value, is the thing that I'm constantly trying to articulate, because it doesn't matter if you produce hundreds of ads at $0. You still have to put a media buy behind them in order for them to be successful in an advertising perspective. I produced a video for $20K for a brand, and they put tens of millions of dollars behind it because it was effective. And if it was $200K, they probably wouldn't have cared because of the results it delivered for the business. So we view as creatives that like the two levers that we have to pull, or the two values that are most important, are our style and our budget of what it costs to produce. Like those are the two things that we can change to show our value to the brand. But ultimately, the true value is, does this deliver a return on investment for the business? And sure, the tools or the technology of generative AI can produce things that are cheap and fast, but are they going to deliver a return on investment? That's where I haven't seen the data come back that convinces me that this is a tool that is worth adopting.
Yeah, we have to be honest about the limitations of AI. And it's like you say, it can do the production side, but the important part where you mentioned, we're designers, we create with an intention of getting a business result, and AI can't understand what's going to create that behavior change in people.
Totally. 100%. And I think the way people would challenge me on that is, but you're not supposed to use it that way. You're not supposed to make the tool do all the work. You're supposed to wield AI. I'm not going to be replaced by an AI. I'm going to be replaced by something using AI. That's the argument, right?
Yeah.
But here's why I have a concern about that argument. Because do I think that I, as somebody who has strategic chops and am an experienced creative director, could use the tech to make work that's effective? Yes, I do. I think that there are probably ways in which I could integrate it to optimize my process to make sure that I am generating work that is effective. But how do you think you get to a person who's in my status? I think that happens by doing the work. I think if you build that shortcut automatically and you go as a senior designer or as a junior designer to just utilizing the tool and becoming a prompt engineer, and you take all these shortcuts to creating work that aesthetically looks at the level of a senior or a principal designer, I think you're taking a lot of shortcuts of building the muscles that are required to do the strategic work. So I don't really buy the argument that, oh, this just frees you up to do the strategic work, because like, how are these people that are coming up in the industry going to get to be able to do that strategic work? They're only going to understand prompting. I feel like we're robbing the future of some of these brilliant creative directors or brilliant strategists if we just rely them on a tool that gives them the shortcuts to get to creating the work. I think that's selling out our future for short-term gains.
It's a good point, and it's only intensified by a lot of people working remotely. You don't get to have that sit next to somebody who's more senior from you, have that kind of interaction. So I think, I don't know what happens, but that is the risk of AI is this kind of skills drain, that you become so reliant on it, and people are intrinsically a little bit, I don't want to say lazy, but we're programmed to expend the least amount of energy.
Because we behave how we're incentivized, right? And if we're incentivized to do things faster, and that's how we're going to behave, we're going to take whatever shortcuts we can to get to the reward. That's just how people operate. And it's something that I look at when we're forecasting the future of how generative AI is gonna fit into our lives and into our industry. Because these are all predictions, right? These are all predictions. We can't truly speculate. Like, I didn't even speculate 5 years ago that we'd be here. So it's really hard for me to speculate where we'll be 5 years from now. But when I look at what does this mean for our future, I could see us very easily pushing the hype train so hard that so many people feel like they have to adopt this technology or quote unquote be left behind. And they rely so heavily on this technology that they're not building the creative muscles that they need, and they're not building the skill set. And 5 years come, and then the data comes back that, oh, the technology by itself isn't delivering the results that we thought it would. And so now we need to go back to more of the creative skill set, and we're starting to lose a generation of people that just don't have the muscles. And so we're in this difficult position where there's a generation gap of people who just don't have the skills. And when they look at the technology and rely on the technology, what happens when the technology that was originally super fast and super cheap gets more expensive? Because let's face it, that's the trajectory of all disruptive companies. They start out cheap to undercut competition, and then they raise their prices. This thing that looked like it was an incredibly valuable thing that could fuel creativity now becomes a tax, and a tax that is more expensive for not the efficacy that was promised. That's the thing that I get fearful of for the people that are starting out in the industry today.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things to be afraid about when it comes to AI.
Yep, for sure.
Let me get your hot take on this. So do you think AI can be stopped then?
No, I don't. In terms of, I guess that it depends on what you mean by stopped. As an industry, can we stop the progression of AI and the prominence and prevalence of it? I don't think so. I don't think that we as creatives can really push back on the industry, because it's... I don't know if you know this, but there's a lot of really rich people that have a pretty significant investment in it. And it's hard to fight back against people with a significant amount of investment in something like this. So I think the hype train is going to keep going. The technology is going to continue to evolve and be part of the public conversation around what we do. And it's going to take major legal regulation in order to change the conversation in any major significant way. Can AI be stopped on a more tactical level with creatives like ourselves? I think so. I think there's a way to combat the problem when a client asks for you, are you going to be using AI on this project? I think there's a way to say no, and here's why. or having the conversations that like, why should I use you as a creative over this technology that I have access to? I think there are ways to stop AI in terms of the adoption on individual levels by articulating the value of what we as creatives bring to the table. I think that is a way in which we have opportunity to carve out a space for ourselves outside of the tech itself.
Yeah, this leads into the next question quite nicely. I have to agree, I'm not sure it can be stopped with all the investment and everything that's going on. So the question becomes, and this is something that I spoke about with Amanda Russell on the last podcast, and I know you're good friends with her.
Love Amanda. She's a delight.
She came up with a really good point. And like, we have all of these visions of the future, they're dystopian, like Terminator, like even just the things we spoke about, like the lack of skills and like how it's going to impact young people. So if we can't stop it, like, do you have a vision of a positive future for AI?
Inherently more cynical than Amanda. I think I don't know that I have the answer of what a utopian version of AI adoption looks like. Because, yeah, I could come up with probably an example of what that looks like, but I could also come up with an example for how trickle-down economics works. But as we look in practice, that just creates greater distribution of wealth and creates a larger gap between the very, very rich and the very, very poor. And I view generative AI or a lot of the AI industry, honestly, in a similar way, where we're looking at tech oligopolies that are trying to be the first and be the fastest at monetizing and productizing this technology. So when I look at the way in which capitalism has gone over the past couple of decades, it's hard for me to come up with a utopian version of what this tech looks like, because I think there's just way too much invested in commercializing it. But if I were to try and take a stab at it, I think it would come from smaller companies taking a real look at how to develop the tech ethically. It would come from companies really looking at how it can empower humans to do their best work, and how the models can be trained ethically. How can they be thought of by creatives, right? Because right now they're developed by business people to achieve business goals. They're not really developed to achieve creative goals. They're not developed to empower creatives. They're developed to reduce the workforce. That is their intent, despite the marketing and what they're trying to tell you of what they're trying to do. The realistic applications of the work is to reduce the workforce. And so if I could envision what a utopian version of this looks like, it would probably be smaller companies coming up with ways that they can build models that would empower artists and solve the problems that we need solving, the things that actually reduce effort away from us and allow us to be more creative. Because I don't think just generating derivative versions of what already exists as fast as possible is what's really empowering creativity. That's empowering productivity, and that's something different. But if there was a way in which this could empower the mind to solve problems, I think that's where my brain goes, and how does this become something that I would get excited about?
Yeah, it's difficult. Like, we have all these negative visions. If I was going to throw something out there, it'd be like, oh, maybe it's a future where we work less. Like, productivity,
sure.
So you can achieve less in more time. We have more free time. But yeah, beyond that, it gets tricky.
It does. Yeah, it does. I love that idea. If I could view in practice that like we would be compensated for the value of the work rather than the amount of time that we put on it. And so again, this is me being cynical and bringing down utopian vision, but that it's really difficult for me to look at this technology, which is inherently capitalist, inherently extremely late stage capitalist, and find a way in which it is a societal net good.
I would say that AI actually destroys capitalism, though. So that might be a good...
Tell me more. Tell me more about this.
No, it's because, okay, so I think I agree that the point, I mean, maybe not the point, but an effect is that there'll be less jobs. So
yeah.
if we continue like we continue, and maybe we'll need a few more technological developments before we get like an AGI that can think like a human. But at that point, it becomes cheaper to employ an AI to do physical or mental work. Like they don't sleep, whatever. So it's like businesses don't employ people. If people don't have a wage because they don't have a job, who are the businesses selling to? This circle, the bottom collapses. So then the most common answer is universal basic income. So then we tax them and they give money to us and we spend it back with them. And then you're like, is that capitalism? Like, why? It was just, you know, that's probably a bit much for this podcast.
I think it just becomes the Judge Dredd universe. I think that's what it actually becomes, but we'll see.
So we're talking a little bit about value-based pricing and things like that and productivity. And I think we're pretty much on the cusp of like technology like Sora coming out. And there's another one that's just been released this week called Pling, which is a Chinese version. So these are, for people that don't know, they're text to video models, but they're hyper realistic.
Sure.
We don't know how good the tools are. Maybe you need to like prompt it 500 times to get one that looks realistic.
Right.
Well, if it's coming. I mean, how do you think this will affect the design industry?
Again, hard to predict, but I think we can look to how this has impacted the copy world to see how this is coming for all of our industries. We've started to see how Midjourney has affected design and illustration, but it's still early on. And video is, of course, the next one that's coming. When I talk to the copywriters who have been experiencing this change, the thing that a lot of them tell me is that the requests for tactical execution have decreased significantly. And the requests for more strategic and thoughtful leadership and overseeing the work has increased. The copywriters that have just been sling words are people who have had a lot more difficulty in the change in the environment than the copywriters who are strategic advisors for their clients and are able to help them come up with solutions that solve their business problem. And I think that's ultimately going to continue across design and video. The people who are like, yeah, you give me a storyboard and I can execute it, are going to have significantly harder of a time than the people who are able to have conversations, understand a client's business problem, and are able to come up with strategic recommendations for how to solve it. Those are the people that I think are going to thrive in this environment that is where there is going to be displacement of work. Like there's just no getting around it. There is going to be displacement of work. And so the thing that I am taking to heart when I think about how I'm marketing myself and building my business is how do I communicate the larger value of what I do that can't be replicated by AI? Because the technical craft, or if it can't be replicated now, it will be once the technology advances. The ability to execute a storyboard with visual polish that is acceptable to a client we're gonna get to that threshold at some point. But the ability to connect with an audience and motivate them to make behavior change that increases their conversion rate, the ability to understand the dynamics of how the work that I create fits into their marketing ecosystem, and the ability to make strong strategic recommendations that are going to help them achieve their business objectives. That's something an AI can't replicate, because that's something that comes from a deep personal experience of doing this work day in and day out, and is something that I can leverage outside of this technology to make myself marketable. So I think that is where all creatives really have to evaluate. In this space where AI, generative AI exists, how am I marketable? What is the greater value that I provide that is more than just pretty pictures? We've relied on talking about pretty pictures and being award-winning storytellers for a really long time. And we're now getting to a space where we're going to have to be better at articulating the value of what we do if we're going to be successful.
That's a great answer. How we spoke a little bit about people, maybe it's happening now because people are working remotely, but how would you advise creatives to get better at those skills?
It's hard. I often say that creatives are our own worst clients because we're the pickiest and we pay the least. It's really difficult to turn that skill set inward, partially because we're so busy doing client work that it feels difficult to then look inward and start doing our own work. But it's something that's so critical, because if you can't market yourself, why should a brand trust that you can do it for them? And so the advice that I give is to start looking deeper at what your value is. Follow the thread, because it starts with, I have this skill set, I have this artistic voice, I have this budget that is competitive in the marketplace. These are the things that we start with in the conversation of what our value is to clients. But we have to start like following that thread of, okay, once you create the work, what happens? What does a client do with it? What is the value that they get on it? Why are they getting a return on that investment? That's the thread that we have to follow in order to better articulate and market our value. And then we have to do the harder part, which is tell that story in a creative and powerful way. We talk about how we're storytellers, but we rarely tell our own story with the same level of creative talent and ability that we claim to possess. And so I think the advice and the suggestion is really understand that value and then communicate it with a level of craft and creative storytelling that you know that you inherently have, because that's what's going to differentiate you in the marketplace. When you are able to tell your story powerfully and authentically and in a way that demonstrates the value of what you do, that's when you're no longer in the conversations of pitching for free. You're no longer just chasing down clients and doing cold calls. Like in my business, I have done 0 cold calls. It is entirely clients coming to me for the work of what I do, because I've gotten better over time at articulating the value of what I do. And I'm able to attract some pretty big clients, and I'm able to build long-standing relationships around this. It is possible, even in this market, which, let's face it, sucks. Even when we have these concerns about generative AI rising and taking our jobs, I've found some opportunity to build a sustainable business. And I don't think I'm even close to the most talented person in this marketplace. There are so many people in so many studios that are so much more talented than me, but I've gotten good at telling the story and communicating the value. If artists get good at telling their story and showing that value, they'll get the work.
Yeah, and this is it. Like, how can we stand out? And you mentioned authenticity and the human connection, like when you're talking about your own branding. And that's the opposite of AI, isn't it? AI kind of eliminates this. It's like you can feel it's a bot talking to you.
100%. Yeah, it sands the edges off. It finds the aggregate of what already exists instead of putting something new out into the world. And I think our own experiences and our own perspectives are the things that are the most marketable about us. And so I'm hesitant to use the technology because I think it is taking away our most competitive advantage.
Definitely. You often look foolish when you speak about the future, but I want to
Totally.
ask a little bit about the future. So you do well on social media, you create content and people engage with that. So one thing that I've seen becoming more prevalent is the AI responses. And LinkedIn, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot here. So if you subscribe to premium on LinkedIn, you can click a button and it'll do an AI response. So as a content creator, like, how does that make you feel?
It just makes me feel like this is silly. Like, why on earth would I use this? And I've seen a lot of people going, is there a Chrome extension that can hide all of my requests to do some kind of AI thing? Which is, yes, that is the tool that I need in my life, because it just feels like clutter directing me to do something that I would never in a million years do. I think we view productivity and over-indexed on productivity in a way that is unhealthy. We view productivity as this, like, the only thing that matters. Can we hustle more? Can we get more out there? Can we get more volume? As if more is inherently better. I would rather send one strong message out there than 100 pieces of trash. Like, they might have around the same effectiveness, but I think the one really strong one is going to be the one that is going to get me the more effective and long-term valuable piece that's going to deliver a better return on investment. The more that I focus my energies on where I'm going to get the most value, I tend to get a better return. And so I just view these as tools that are there because the hype around this is so real. And so it's, hey, like, we're hip now because we have AI responses. We're like a modern tech company. Hello, fellow kids. Like, it just feels like a jumping in a way that when I look at the user experience of using it, I'm like, why would I want this? This is nowhere where I want the AI to be utilized. Would I want AI to filter job recommendations for me in ways that are optimized to what my experience is? Yes, that's a way you can utilize AI to enhance my experience of using your platform. When I'm reaching out to send a message to build a relationship, that is not where I want this tool to be utilized. It just ways to show that they're an innovative company that's building powerful product features rather than being thoughtful about the way they utilize them.
Yeah, I think it's really stupid. Social media is all about the interaction of people. And I've heard you say this before. Even now you're on a podcast, you're not really doing it. I mean, you might enjoy it, but you're not doing it for fun. Like, also, it's marketing. You're marketing yourself.
It's marketing.
And you do that because you want a return on that. So if we're all on social media and we're getting hundreds of likes from AI bots, like, there's no return.
There's no return.
Like, I've been speaking to you for almost an hour now, so I imagine you have to go. I always like to end on asking the guests some advice. Would your advice be to creatives in regards to AI?
This is a big one. I think the biggest advice that I would give is that the one thing that you can't really do in this space is ignore it. And I think that's maybe a cliche. I think we've all kind of heard this kind of advice. I think we can't ignore the effect that it's having on our marketplace. We can't ignore the fact that this is what our clients are hearing day in and day out. We can't ignore the conversation that's happening around this disruptive technology, because whether they ask you on the call about it or not, they're thinking about it. And so we have to have a response. We have to be thoughtful about the way we're thinking about this tech. I am vocal about it because I want to communicate the value of what I bring to the table as a creative and as a strategic leader in this space. I could ignore it. I could just talk about the work of what I do and how it's valuable, but talking about how I think I can outpace AI in the areas that really matter, the return on investment of the creative, is going to position me to have these conversations in a more equal playing field. Because if I just ignore it, if I put my head in the sand and just really just have the conversation like this isn't there, the elephant isn't in the room, I think I'm going to lose out in the long run. So I think you need to have a position on AI, whether you are going to be utilizing it broadly, whether you're utilizing it for specific areas that will help you in your process, or you are not utilizing it. I don't think that there is necessarily a wrong answer in the space. Your mileage is going to vary on everything here. But I think you do need to have a clear stance, and you should be communicating what that is, because it is part of the marketing conversation when you talk about it. It just is the reality. It is too prevalent in the minds of your customers that you have to have a clear answer and position on it.
Yeah. And thanks for chatting to me about this, and thanks for adding kind of nuance to the conversation. We made it through. We haven't killed each other.
It's true.
We do have different opinions. I like that you say you can't ignore it. Obviously, I've gone the other route, and I talk about this, and I learn, and hopefully people enjoy these conversations. And if you want to learn more, then I create content about this.
Hopefully, they're less me railing on it in these other conversations. I'm sure they're more educational and valuable for the people who want to dive in more.
Actually, this is the important thing, because it's not black and white, and I'm not like, let's use AI for everything, because you shouldn't. Like, but this is where the nuance and these conversations you can't have on social media.
No. This is for the 140 or 280 characters, right? This is a conversation that just requires more thought and requires us to really share our perspectives and our experience, because they are going to devolve into just ad hominems very quickly if we try and have the conversation on social. So thank you for having me on. Thank you for challenging me to think about this in a way that is deeper than the binary pull quotes that we all have been across the social channels. I appreciate it, Luke.
It's been great from my perspective. I think people will enjoy one. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Cheers.